Rhiannon, wife of Tuor, dwelt with the people of the house of Hedor. But when rumour came to Dolomin of the Nenaiath Arnoediad, and yet she could hear no news of her lord, she became distraught, and wandered forth into the wild alone. There she would have perished, but the grey elves came to her aid, for there was a dwelling of this people in the mountains westward of Lake Mithrim, and thither they led her, and she was there delivered of a son before the end of the year of lamentation. And Rhiannon said to the elves, Let him be called Tuor, for that name his father chose, ere war came between us. And I beg of you to foster him, and to keep him hidden in your care, for I forebode that great good for elves and men shall come from him. But I must go in search of Tuor, my lord. Then the elves pitied her, but one, Aniel, who alone of all that went to war from that people had returned from the Nenaiath, said to her, Alas, lady, it is known now that Tuor fell at the side of Hurin, his brother, and he lies, I deem, in the great hill of slain that the orcs have raised upon the field of battle. Therefore Rhiannon arose, and left the dwelling of the elves, and she passed through the land of Mithrim, and came at last to the Howden Dingin in the waste of Anfauglith, and there she laid her down and died. But the elves cared for the infant son of Tuor, and Tuor grew up among them, and he was fair of face, and golden-haired after the manner of his father's kin, and he became strong and tall, and valiant. And being fostered by the elves, he had lore and skill no less than the princes of the Edain, ere ruin came upon the north. But with the passing of the years, the life of the former folk of Hithlum, such as still remained, elves or men, became ever harder and more perilous. For as is elsewhere told, Morgoth broke his pledges to the Easterlings that had served him, and he denied to them the rich lands of Beleriand which they had coveted, and he drove away these evil folk into Hithlum, and there commanded them to dwell. And though they loved Morgoth no longer, they served him still in fear, and hated all the elven folk, and they despised the remnant of the house of Hedor, the aged, and women and children for the most part. And they oppressed them, and wedded their women by force, and took their lands and goods, and enslaved their children. Orcs came, and went about the land as they would, pursuing the lingering elves into the fastness of the mountains, and taking many captive to the mines of Engban to labour as the thralls of Morgoth. Therefore Aniel led his small people to the caves of Enderoth, and there they lived a hard and weary life until Tuor was 16 years of age, and was become strong and able to wield arms, the axe and bow of the grey elves. And his heart grew hot within him at the tale of the griefs of his people, and he wished to go forth and avenge them on the Orcs and Easterlings. But Aniel forbade this. Far hence, I deem, your doom lies, Tuor, son of Tuor, he said. And this land shall not be freed from the shadow of Morgoth until Thangorodrim itself be overthrown. Therefore we are resolved at last to forsake it, and to depart into the south, and with us you shall go. But how shall we escape the net of our enemies? Said Tuor, for the marching of so many together will surely be marked. We shall not march through the land openly, said Aniel. And if our fortune is good, we shall come to the secret way, which we call Anon in Gelid, the gate of the Noldor, for it was made by the skill of that people long ago in the days of Turgon. At that name Tuor was stirred, though he knew not why, and he questioned Aniel concerning Turgon. He is a son of Fingolfin, said Aniel, and is now counted High King of the Noldor since the fall of Fingon, for he lives yet most feared of the foes of Morgoth, and he escaped from the ruin of their near Naiath, when Hurin of Dor-lomin and Huor your father held the passes of Sirion behind him. Then I will go and seek Turgon, said Tuor, for surely he will lend me aid for my father's sake. That you cannot, said Anniel, for his stronghold is hidden from the eyes of elves and men, and we know not where it stands. Of the Noldor some, may be, know the way thither, but they will speak of it to none. Yet if you would have speech with them, then come with me, as I bid you, for in the far havens of the south you may meet with wanderers from the hidden kingdom. Thus it came to pass that the elves forsook the caves of Androth, and Tuor went with them, but their enemies kept watch upon their dwellings, and were soon aware of their march. And they had not gone far from the hills into the plain before they were assailed by a great force of orcs and easterlings, and they were scattered far and wide, fleeing into the gathering night. But Tuor's heart was kindled with the fire of battle, and he would not flee. But boy as he was, he wielded the axe as his father before him, and for long he stood his ground and slew many that assailed him. But at the last he was overwhelmed and taken captive and led before Lorgon, the Easterling. Lorgon was held the chieftain of the Easterlings and claimed to rule all Dor-lomin as a fief under Morgoth, and he took Tuor to be his slave. Hard and bitter then was his life, for it pleased Lorgon to treat Tuor the more evilly, as he was of the kin of the former lords, and he sought to break, if he could, the pride of the house of Hador. But Tuor saw wisdom, and endured all pains and taunts with watchful patience, so that in time his lot was somewhat lightened, and at the least he was not starved, as were many of Lorgon's unhappy thralls, for he was strong and skilful, and Lorgon fed his beasts of burden well, while they were young and could work. But after 3 years of thraldom, Tuor saw at last a chance of escape. He was come now almost to his full stature, taller and swifter than any of the Easterlings, and being sent with other thralls on an errand of labour into the woods, he turned suddenly on the guard and slew them with an axe, and fled into the hills. The Easterlings hunted him with dogs, but without avail, for well nigh all the hounds of Lorgon were his friends, and if they came up with him they would fawn upon him, and then run homeward at his command. Thus he came back at least to the caves of Androth, and dwelt there alone, and for 4 years he was an outlaw in the land of his fathers, grim and solitary, and his name was feared, for he went often abroad, and slew many of the Easterlings that he came upon. Then they set a great price upon his head, but they did not dare to come to his hiding place, even with strength of men, for they feared the elven folk, and shunned the caves where they had dwelt. Yet it is said that Tuor's journeys were not made for the purpose of vengeance. Rather he sought ever for the gate of the Noldor, of which Anniel had spoken. But he found it not, for he knew not where to look, and such few of the elves as lingered still in the mountains had not heard of it. Now Tuor knew that though fortune still favoured him, yet in the end the days of an outlaw are numbered, and of ever few, and without hope. Nor was he willing to live thus for ever a wild man in the houseless hills, and his heart urged him ever to great deeds. Herein, it is said, the power of Ulmo was shown, for he gathered tidings of all that passed in Beleriand, and every stream that flowed from Middle-earth to the great sea was to him a messenger, both to and fro, and he remained also in friendship as of old with Círdan, and the shipwrights at mouths of Sirion. And at this time most of all Ulmo gave heed to the fates of the house of Hador, for in his deep counsels he purposed that they should play great part in his designs for the succour of the exiles. And he knew well of the plight of Tuor, for Niall and many of his folk had indeed escaped from Gondolin, and come at last to Círdan in the far south. Thus it came to pass that on a day in the beginning of the year 23 since the Nearniath, Tuor sat by a spring that trickled forth near to the door of the cave where he dwelt, and he looked out westward towards the cloudy sunset. Then suddenly it came into his heart that he would wait no longer, but would arise and go. I will leave now the grey land of my kin that are no more, and I will go in search of my doom. But whither shall I turn? Long have I sought the gate and found it not. Then he took up the harp which he bore ever with him, being skilled in playing upon its strings, and heedless of the peril of his clear voice alone in the waste he sang an elven song of the north for the uplifting of hearts. And even as he sang, the well at his feet began to boil with great increase of water, and it overflowed, and a rill ran noisily down the rocky hillside before him, and Tuor took this as a sign, and he arose at once and followed after it. Thus he came down from the tall hills of Mithrim, and passed out into the northward plain of Dor-lomin, and ever the stream grew as he followed it westward, until after 3 days he could descry in the west the long grey ridges of arid Lomin, that in those regions march north and south, fencing off the far coastlands of the western shores. To those hills in all his journeys Tuor had never come. Now the land became more broken and stony again as it approached the hills, and soon it began to rise before Tuor's feet, and the stream went down into a cloven bed. But even as dim dusk came on the 3rd day of his journey, Tuor found before him a wall of rock, and there was an opening therein like a great arch, and the stream passed in and was lost. Then Tuor was dismayed, and he said, "So my hope has cheated me. The sign in the hills has led me only to a dark end in the midst of the land of my enemies." And grey at heart he sat among the rocks on the high bank of the stream, keeping watch through a bitter fireless night, for it was yet but the month of Sulime, and no stir of spring had come to that far northern land, and a shrill wind blew from the east. But even as the light of the coming sun shone pale in the far mists of Mithrim, Tuor heard voices, and looking down he saw in amazement 2 elves that waded in the shallow water, and as they climbed up steps hewn in the bank, Tuor stood up and called to them. At once they drew their bright swords and sprang towards him. Then he saw that they were grey cloaked, but mail clad under, and he marvelled, for they were fair and more fell to look upon, because of the light of their eyes, than any of the elven folk that he yet had known. He stood to his full height and awaited them. But when they saw that he drew no weapon, but stood alone, and greeted them in the elven tongue, they sheathed their swords and spoke courteously to him. And one said, "Gelmir and Arminas we are, of Finarfin's people. Are you not one of the Edain of old that dwelt in these lands ere the Nearniath? And indeed, of the kindred of Hador and Hurin, I deem you, for so the gold of your hair declares you." And Tuor answered, "Yea, I am Tuor, son of Hur, son of Galdor, son of Hador. But now at last I desire to leave this land where I am outlawed and kinless." Then said Gelmir, If you would escape and find the havens in the south, already your feet have been guided on the right road." "So I thought," said Tuor, "for I followed a sudden spring of water in the hills until it joined this treacherous stream. But now I know not whither to turn, for it has gone into darkness." "Through darkness one may come to the light," said Gelmir. "Yet one will walk under the sun while one may," said Tuor. "But since you are of that people, tell me, if you can, where lies the gate of the Noldor, for I have sought it long, ever since Anile, my foster father of the grey elves, spoke of it to me." Then the elves laughed and said, "Your search is ended, for we have ourselves just passed the gate. There it stands before you." And they pointed to the arch into which the water flowed. "Come now. Through darkness you shall come to the light. We will set your feet on the road. But we cannot guide you far, for we are sent back to the lands whence we fled upon an urgent errand." "But fear not," said Gelmir. "A great doom is written upon your brow, and it shall lead you far from these lands, far indeed from Middle-earth, as I guess." Then Tuor followed the Noldor down the steps and waded in the cold water, until they passed into the shadow beyond the arch of stone. And then Gelmir brought forth one of those lamps for which the Noldor were renowned, for they were made of old in Valinor, and neither wind nor water could quench them. And when they were unhooded, they set forth a clear blue light from a flame imprisoned in white crystal. Now by the light that Gelmir held above his head, Tuor saw that the river began to go suddenly down a smooth slope into a great tunnel. Beside its rock-hewn course there ran long flights of steps, leading on and downward into a deep gloom, beyond the beam of the lamp. When they had come to the foot of the rapids, they stood under a great dome of rock, and there the river rushed over a steep fall with a great noise that echoed in the vault. And it passed them on again beneath another arch into a further tunnel. Beside the falls the Noldor halted and bade Tuor farewell. "Now we must return and go our ways with all speed," said Gelmir, "for matters of great peril are moving in Beleriand." "Is then the hour come when Turgon shall come forth?" said Tuor. Then the elves looked at him in amazement. "That is a matter which concerns the Noldor rather than the sons of men," said Araminas. "What know you of Turgon?" "Little," said Tuor, "save that my father aided his escape from the Nearnioth, and that in his hidden stronghold dwells the hope of the Noldor. Yet though I know not why, ever his name stirs in my heart, and comes to my lips. And had I my will, I would go in search of him, rather than tread this dark way of dread, unless perhaps this secret road is the way to his dwelling." "Who shall say?" answered the elf, "for since the dwelling of Turgon is hidden, so also are the ways thither. I know them not, though I have sought them long. Yet if I knew them, I would not reveal them to you, nor to any among men." But Gelmir said, "Yet I have heard that your house has the favour of the Lord of Waters, and if his counsels lead you to Turgon, then surely shall you come to him, whithersoever you turn. Follow now the road to which the waters brought you from the hills, and fear not. You shall not walk long in darkness. Farewell, and think not that our meeting was by chance, for the dweller in the deep moves many things in this land still. Anar Kaluva Tialiana." With that the Noldor turned and went back up the long stairs, but Tuor stood still until the light of their lamp was lost, and he was alone in a darkness deeper than night amid the roaring of the falls. Then, summoning his courage, he set his left hand to the rock wall and felt his way forward, slowly at first, and then more quickly as he became more used to the darkness, and found nothing to hinder him. And after a great while, as it seemed to him, when he was weary and yet unwilling to rest in the black tunnel, he saw far before him a light, and hastening on he came to a tall and narrow cleft, and followed the noisy stream between its leaning walls out into a golden evening. For he was come into a deep ravine with tall sheer sides, and it ran straight towards the west, and before him the setting sun, going down through a clear sky, shone into the ravine and kindled its walls with yellow fire. And the waters of the river glittered like gold as they broke and foamed upon many gleaming stones. In that deep place Tuor went on now in great hope and delight, finding a path beneath the southern wall, where there lay a long and narrow strand. And when night came, and the river rushed on unseen, save for a glint of high stars mirrored in a dark pools, then he rested and slept, for he felt no fear beside that water in which the power of Ulmo ran. With the coming of day he went on again without haste. The sun rose behind his back and set before his face, and where the water foamed among the boulders or rushed over sudden falls, at morning and evening rainbows were woven across the stream. Wherefore he named that ravine Sirith Niniach. Thus Tuor journeyed slowly for 3 days, drinking the cold water, but desiring no food, though there were many fish that shone as gold and silver, or gleamed with colours like to the rainbows in the spray above. And on the 4th day the channel grew wider, and its walls lower and less sheer, but the river ran deeper and more strongly, for high hills now marched on either side, and fresh waters spilled from them into Sirith Niniach, over shimmering falls. There long while Tuor sat, watching the swirling of the stream, and listening to its endless voice, until night came, and stars shone cold and white in the dark lane of sky above him. Then he lifted up his voice, and plucked the strings of his harp, and above the noise of the water the sound of his song and the sweet thrilling of the harp were echoed in stone, and multiplied, and went forth and rang in the night-clad hills, until all the empty land was filled with music beneath the stars. For though he knew it not, Tuor was now come to the echoing mountains of Lamoth, about the firth of Dringist. There once long ago Fëanor had landed from the sea, and the voices of his host were swelled to a mighty clamour upon the coast of the north ere the rising of the moon. Then Tuor was filled with wonder, and stayed his song, and slowly the music died in the hills, and there was silence. And then amid the silence he heard in the air above him a strange cry, and he knew not of what creature that cry came. Now he said, "It is a fey voice." Now, nay, it is a small beast that is wailing in the waste. And then, hearing it again, he said, "Surely it is the cry of some night-faring bird that I know not." And it seemed to him a mournful sound, and yet he desired none the less to hear it and follow it, for it called him, he knew not whither. The next morning he heard the same voice above his head, and looking up he saw 3 great white birds beating down the ravine against the westerly wind, and their strong wings shone in the new risen sun, and as they passed over him they wailed aloud. Thus for the first time he beheld the great gulls, beloved of the Teleri. Then Tuor arose to follow them, and so that he might better mark whither they flew, he climbed the cliff upon his left hand, and stood upon the top, and felt a great wind out of the west rush against his face, and his hair streamed from his head, and he drank deep of that new air, and said, This uplifts the heart like the drinking of cool wine. But he knew not that the wind came fresh from the great sea. Now Tuor went on once more, seeking the gulls high above the river. And as he went, the sides of the ravine drew together again, and he came to a narrow channel, and it was filled with a great noise of water. And looking down, Tuor saw a great marvel. And it seemed to him, for a wild flood came up the narrows and strove with the river that would still press on, and a wave like a wall rose up almost to the cliff top, crowned with foam crest flying in the wind. Then the channel, drowning it in deep water, and the rolling of the boulders was like thunder as it passed. Thus Tuor was saved by the call of the seabirds from death in the rising tide, and that was very great because of the season of the air and of the high wind from the sea. But now Tuor was dismayed by the fury of the strange waters, and he turned aside and went away southward, and so came not to the long shores of the Firth of Dringist, but wandered still for some days in a rugged country bare of trees. And it was swept by a wind from the sea, and all that grew there, herb or bush, leaned ever to the dawn because of the prevalence of that wind from the west. In this way Tuor passed into the borders of Nevrast, where once Turgon had dwelt, and at last, at unawares, for the cliff tops at the margin of the land were higher than the slopes behind, he came suddenly to the black brink of Middle Earth, and saw the great sea, Belagia, the shoreless. And at that hour the sun went down beyond the rim of the world as a mighty fire, and Tuor stood alone upon the cliff with outspread arms, and a great yearning filled his heart. It is said that he was the first of men to reach the great sea, and that none, save the Eldar, have ever felt more deeply the longing that it brings. Tuor tarried many days in Nevrast, and it seemed good to him, for that land, being fenced by mountains from the north and east and nigh to the sea, was milder and more kindly than the plains of Hithlum. He was long used to dwell alone as a hunter in the wild, and he found no lack of food, for spring was busy in Nevrast, and the air was filled with the noise of birds, both those that dwelt in multitudes upon the shores, and those that teemed in the marshes of Lenaiwen, in the midst of that hollow land. But in those days no voice of elves or men was heard in all the solitude. To the borders of the great mere Tuor came, but its waters were beyond his reach, because of the wide miles and the pathless forests of reeds that lay all about, and soon he turned away and went back to the coast, for the sea drew him, and he was not willing to dwell long where he could not hear the sound of its waves. And in the shorelands Tuor first found traces of the Noldor of old, for among the tall and sea-hewn cliffs south of Dringist there were many coves and sheltered inlets, with beaches of white sand among the black gleaming rocks, and leading down to such places Tuor found often winding stairs cut in the living stone, and by the water edge were ruined quays, built of great blocks, hewn from the cliffs, where elven ships had once been moored. In those regions Tuor long remained, watching the ever-changing sea, while through spring and summer the slow year wore on, and darkness deepened in Beleriand, and the autumn of the doom of Nargothrond drew near. And maybe birds saw from afar the fell winter that was to come, for those that were wont to go south gathered early to depart, and others that used to dwell in the north came from their homes to Nevrast. And one day, as Tuor sat upon the shore, he heard the rush and whine of great wings, and he looked up, and saw 7 white swans flying in a swift wedge southward. But as they came above him, they wheeled and flew suddenly down, and alighted with a great plash and churning of water. Now Tuor loved swans, which he knew on the grey pools of Mithrim, and the swan moreover had been the token of Nile and his foster folk. He rose therefore to greet the birds, and called to them, marvelling to behold that they were greater and prouder than any of their kind that he had seen before. But they beat their wings and uttered harsh cries, as if they were wroth with him and would drive him from the shore. Then with a great noise they rose again from the water, and flew above his head, so that the rush of their wings blew upon him as a whistling wind, and wheeling in a wide circle they ascended into the high air, and went away south. Then Tuor cried aloud, "Here now comes another sign that I have tarried too long." And straightway he climbed to the cliff top, and there he beheld the swans still wheeling on high. But when he turned southward and set out to follow them, they flew swiftly away. Now Tuor journeyed south along the coast for full 7 days, and each morning he was aroused by the rush of wings above him in the dawn, and each day the swans flew on as he followed after. And as he went the great cliffs became lower, and their tops were clothed deep with flowering turf, and away eastward there were woods turning yellow in the waning of the year. But before him, drawing ever nearer, he saw a line of great hills that barred his way, marching westward until they ended in a tall mountain, a dark and cloud-helmed tower reared upon mighty shoulders above a great green cape thrust out into the sea. Those grey hills were indeed the western outliers of Eridwethrin, the north fence of Beleriand, and the mountain was Mount Taras, westernmost of all the towers of that land, whose head a mariner would first descry across the miles of the sea. As he drew near to the mortal shores, beneath its long slopes in bygone days Turgon had dwelt in the halls of Vinyamar, eldest of all the works of stone that the Noldor built in the lands of their exile. There it still stood, desolate but enduring, high upon great terraces that looked towards the sea. The years had not shaken it, and the servants of Morgoth had passed it by, but wind and rain and frost had graven it, and upon the coping of its walls and the great shingles of its roofs there was a deep growth of grey-green plants that, living upon the salt air, throve even in the cracks of barren stone. Now Tuor came to the ruins of a lost road, and he passed amid green mounds and leaning stones, and so came as the day was waning to the old hall and its high and windy courts. No shadow of fear or evil lurked there, but an awe fell upon him, thinking of those that had dwelt there and had gone, none knew whither, the proud people, deathless but doomed, from far beyond the sea. And he turned and looked, as often their eyes had looked, out across the glitter of the unquiet waters to the end of sight. Then he turned back again, and saw the swans had alighted on their highest terrace, and stood before the west door of the hall, and they beat their wings, and it seemed to him that they beckoned him to enter. Then Tuor went up the wide stairs, now half hidden in thrift and campion, and he passed under the mighty lintel, and entered the shadows of the house of Turgon. And he came at last to a high-pillared hall. If great it had appeared from without, now vast and wonderful, it seemed to Tuor from within, and for awe he wished not to awake the echoes in its emptiness. Nothing could he see there, save at the eastern end a high seat upon a dais, and softly as he might he paced towards it, but the sound of his feet rang upon the paved floor as the steps of doom, and echoes ran before him along the pillared aisles. As he stood before the great chair in the gloom, and saw that it was hewn of a single stone, and written with strange signs. The sinking sun drew level with a high window under the westward gable, and a shaft of light smote the wall before him, and glittered as it were upon burnished metal. Then Tuor, marvelling, saw that on the wall behind the throne were hung a shield and a great hauberk, and a helm, and a long sword in a sheath. The hauberk shone as it were wrought of silver untarnished, and the sunbeam gilded it with sparks of gold. But the shield was of a shape strange to Tuor's eyes, for it was long and tapering, and its field was blue, in the midst of which was wrought an emblem of a white swan's wing. Then Tuor spoke, and his voice rang as a challenge in the roof. By this token I will take these arms unto myself, and upon myself whatsoever doom they bear. And he lifted down the shield, and found it light and wieldy beyond his guess, for it was wrought, it seemed, of wood, but overlaid by the craft of elven smiths with plates of metal, strong, yet thin as foil, whereby it had been preserved from worm and weather. Then Tuor arrayed himself in the hauberk, and set the helm upon his head, and he girt himself with the sword. Black were sheath and belt with clasps of silver. Thus armed, he went forth from Turgon's hall, and stood upon the high terraces of Taras in the red light of the sun. None were there to see him as he gazed westward, gleaming in silver and gold. And he knew not that in that hour he appeared as one of the mighty of the West, and fit to be the father of the kings of men beyond the sea, as it was indeed his doom to be. But in the taking of those arms a change came upon Tuor, son of Huor, and his heart grew great within him. And as he stepped down from the doors, the swans did him reverence, and plucking each a great feather from their wings, they proffered them to him, laying their long necks upon the stone before his feet. And he took the 7 feathers, and set them in the crest of his helm. And straightway the swans arose and flew north in the sunset, and Tuor saw them no more. Now Tuor felt his feet drawn to the sea strand, and he went down by long stairs to a wide shore upon the north side of Taras Ness. And as he went, he saw that the sun was sinking low into a great black cloud that came up over the rim of the darkening sea, and it grew cold, and there was a stirring and murmur as of a storm to come. And Tuor stood upon the shore, and the sun was like a smoky fire beyond the menace of the sky. And it seemed to him that a great wave rose far off and rolled towards the land. But wonder held him, and he remained there unmoved. And the wave came towards him, and upon it lay a mist of shadow. Then suddenly, as it drew near, it curled and broke, and rushed forward into long arms of foam. But where it had broken there stood dark against the rising storm a living shape of great height and majesty.